Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We'll start pretty much on time. There's still a few people coming in. Yeah, some people are already saying hello through the chat window. So yeah, good morning to everyone, wherever you're from. I've been asked to talk today about UK in particular, and options in the UK for clean hydrogen production. So I shall do that. I would hope that, and we've got some people from Germany and South Africa and elsewhere, I would hope that some of the things that I say are also going to be relevant in terms of influences and kind of ideas and so on, wherever you are in the world. So I'm certainly not, I'll talk about the kind of UK as an example and what's happening here, but I think some of the lessons are certainly going to go across different types of markets as well. I don't know, some of you may not have been on sessions that I've run before. On my kind of training sessions, I tend to kind of take questions as we go through. I think for this session, what I'll try and do is I'll just kind of rattle through my presentation, hopefully in a reasonably quick time, and then have kind of Q&A at the end. There's so many people. There's a big list of attendees here. I think if we try and do things as we go along, we may never finish. So I'll try and kind of get through the content, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. There is a Q&A tab, which I've got open on a separate screen, which is why you probably see me looking the other way occasionally. So fire away with your questions whenever, and I'll go through as many of those as I can towards the end. Try and pick out some of the ones that don't overlap too much. For those of you who have not come across me before, I'm not going to spend hours talking about myself, but I suppose I best say who I am and why I'm here. My name's John. I've been involved in the clean energy sector for about 15 or 16 years now. I run my own business, doing my own kind of independent industry research and analysis. A lot of what I do now in terms of turning that into an income into my business is training, business education, I'd call it, more than training, helping people understand a bit better some of the technologies in the clean energy transition and also the economics of those technologies. So I spend a lot of time bridging the gap between investors who want to understand risks around technology and also technology people who want to understand why investors aren't throwing money at their lovely technology. They want to know a bit more about how the economics work, how investment decisions work, and that kind of stuff. So I'm doing this in association with World Hydrogen Leaders, which is something that started up a couple of years ago now. I've been involved with World Hydrogen Leaders since they began. I also write a weekly column for them called This Week in Hydrogen. But I think it's important to make clear I'm not here to kind of sell you hydrogen. I don't sell any hydrogen products. I've been involved. I also talk about battery electric vehicles. I also talk about electrification, renewable power and so on, still battery storage and so on. So hopefully I shall do my best to give you as much as anyone can in this world, an independent view of hydrogen. I'm not here to kind of hype up hydrogen or point out some of the challenges. I've been asked to focus particularly on the supply side, the kind of clean hydrogen production side, but of course I'm more than happy to answer questions later on other aspects of hydrogen, how that fits in. And of course, without demand for hydrogen, then there's no point having supply anyway. So without further ado, let's kind of crack on. A good place to start when we're talking about options is, of course, to think about what options for hydrogen might be. I've actually got a much more complicated version of this slide with lots and lots of different colours on. There's a reason why I think colours, you can get kind of over obsessed with colours. There's no kind of international standards document you can download that tells you exactly what one colour is and what one isn't. I think the top row are hopefully pretty well established. We'll be talking mainly today about green and blue hydrogen, which are probably the ones that you've come across more often than not. Grey hydrogen is just, I'm kind of lumping in all current hydrogen production into that. I'll talk about, I'll kind of run through these pathways shortly. But I've seen also terms like pink hydrogen, yellow hydrogen, brown hydrogen, black hydrogen. I mean, it just gets slightly ridiculous. And I'll tell you why it gets a bit ridiculous actually in the following slide. But to break down kind of options for hydrogen production, you can break them down quite simply into two main areas. One is to split hydrogen out of water, and the other is to split hydrogen out of some kind of hydrocarbon. So the point here being that hydrogen doesn't tend to float around as it's in its own form. It's attached to something else. We have to produce hydrogen. It's not like oil and gas where we can kind of drill a hole, although there's also another topic called natural hydrogen where people could bring up where perhaps you can do that. But broadly speaking, and certainly current hydrogen production, we're separating hydrogen out of something else. So this is simplifying it. We can split water by throwing electricity at water, and we split it out into hydrogen, and we also get a co-product out of that, which is oxygen, which might be useful. If we do that with clean electricity, then that's what we call green hydrogen. Now, of course, we could also do that with non-clean electricity. I'm yet to see a kind of consistent colour that people call hydrogen just from using grid electricity, which wouldn't necessarily be clean. I'm kind of making the assumption that when I'm talking about hydrogen here, I'm going to be talking about clean hydrogen going forwards. There's not really much point, and I think you'll find from a policy point of view, there's not going to be really any substantial support for growing hydrogen, certainly not in the long term, if it's not part of the kind of clean energy picture or the clean economy picture. So we say it doesn't have to be energy. So I'm going to, when I talk about green hydrogen here, I'm making kind of assumption that that hydrogen is going to come via renewable electricity. That's one thing we can do, and that's sort of fairly simple. There's kind of one pathway there. There are lots and lots of different potential pathways that you could produce here. As I say, I've simplified this a fair bit. We can take various types of hydrocarbons. If we're talking about the UK, we're going to be talking about natural gas, fossil gas. If you're in China, it could be coal, though. It can also be things like various sources of biomass. That could be biogas, so replacing natural gas. It could be biomass itself, solid biomass. It can be various biogenic sources of waste. There are companies also looking at using municipal waste, plastic content, which again, I would kind of come into kind of fossil hydrocarbon in effect. And there is a whole bunch of different processes, which I broadly mentioned here. Reforming, tend to talk about reforming when we're talking about turning natural gas, or it could be biogas, into hydrogen. Gasification, we tend to use that term more when we're talking about solid feedstocks like coal, like plastics, like solid biomasses, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of complexity here, and actually through those processes, there are some of those, we don't necessarily have to go to hydrogen. There's a bunch of those processes that produce what's called syngas, and in fact, syngas is really a precursor for ending up down here. And syngas is very commonly used in a whole bunch of what we call the kind of petrochemicals industry as a feedstock into reforming a whole bunch of other molecules. So that's a whole kind of rabbit hole we could disappear down into. But broadly speaking, what we're doing is we are obviously separating out the hydrogen from the carbon. In conventional processes, the carbon comes out as carbon dioxide, and we emit it into the atmosphere. And there's been various You can see various numbers around that. I think the IEA number is about 830 million tonnes per year of carbon dioxide emissions associated with hydrogen. There's been some numbers recently comparing the amount of emissions with current hydrogen production with aviation, emissions from aviation. They're in this kind of similar ballpark. And that's what we call grey hydrogen. So grey hydrogen is producing hydrogen with carbon dioxide emissions. So that's fossil carbon from the feedstock heading off into the sky and making, and certainly not being a clean process. The reason I mentioned one other colour here, and again, not everyone uses this colour, so don't worry so much about the colour, but it's to point out that if the source of hydrocarbon is not fossil, if it's biomass, then you can argue that that's less, well, it certainly is less problematic from a carbon emissions point of view, or should be, depending on the biomass supply chain, because the carbon you emit is not fossil carbon, it's carbon that's floating around in the atmosphere. So we've got current, and that current carbon production is, depending whose numbers you look at, is somewhere kind of 97 to 98% of current hydrogen production. So hydrogen's a big emitter. So one way we can avoid those emissions is to split water instead, so we don't have to worry about carbon. The other way we could avoid those emissions is to capture that carbon. We could take the CO2, instead of letting it head off into the sky, we could attach carbon capture technology at the back of our process, and then we could transport that carbon dioxide somewhere and we could stuff it underground, we could store it. Or, as these days, that is often increased to CCUS, we can maybe utilise that carbon to offset the need to drill more carbon out of the ground, for example. And so there's that whole range of processes. If we capture the carbon rather than let it head off into the sky, that's what we're going to call blue hydrogen. If you capture carbon from a process that started with biomass, then you're basically taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the form of the biomass, and then you're stuffing it underground. That's what we can also term bioenergy carbon capture and storage. We could potentially even get into things like negative emissions technologies there. But again, I'm going to, anything where it's basically a pretty much conventional process of splitting out the hydrogen and then capturing the carbon, I'm going to term blue hydrogen. And then slightly differently, I'm not going to really talk about it much today. That's not to say it's not important, but in terms of kind of mass scale hydrogen production going forwards, it's probably going to be more of a kind of specialist, more of a kind of niche area, is what I would call turquoise hydrogen, which is where, again, we split up our hydrocarbon, but we do it without any oxygen around, which means that we don't get CO2, we get carbon, and carbon in its elemental form is solid. So in effect, we've kind of captured the carbon in solid form. So there's various things we can do with solid carbon. And actually the business cases for turquoise hydrogen, certainly at the moment, are more around the value of that carbon than they are around the value of the hydrogen. So that's a kind of very simplified. What I'm going to be focusing on here, given talking about the UK in particular, is the discussion between green and between blue. Again, making the assumption that grey, adding on more grey hydrogen production is not going to be either politically or socially acceptable, and that if we are going to do hydrogen on a relatively big scale, most of the discussion is between those two. It's between electrolysis, splitting water, and it's between some process of using a hydrocarbon feedstock and then capturing the carbon at the other end of that. It's blue hydrogen. As I say, that's not to dismiss things like there are projects in the UK going on looking at using things like municipal waste to produce hydrogen. There are projects looking at turquoise hydrogen production and so on. But the big discussion is really green versus blue. Okay, why are colours? Why are there too many colours? Why should we not get too hung up on colours? In the UK, this is certainly the reason. It's not the only country that's going to do this. In Europe, there's also standards around definitions of low carbon hydrogen. Australia is looking at doing the same as well. This was published just about 2 weeks ago. I think it was the 8th of April or something. What's called the UK Low Carbon Hydrogen Standard. And so this is basically saying that whatever pathway you do, rather than calling it by colour and claiming it's clean, we need you to actually meet a number. We need you to meet a specific amount of emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent, for each kind of unit of hydrogen you produce. The document defines it in this term: 20 grams of CO2 equivalent for each megajoule of hydrogen measured in lower heating value that you produce. I tend to prefer to talk in kilograms, so I did so if you do the conversion, that turns out about 2.4 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen you produce. So it's not zero carbon. We're not talking about a process here that is zero carbon. We're talking about processes that count as low carbon, and again, it depends exactly how you measure current production, but compared just to the process emissions of things like reforming, this is something like a kind of 75% reduction. And actually, to meet this standard, you're going to have to look at more than just the process emissions. If you look at the document that outlines how you have to do this, that standard is going to include not just the process, it's going to include other things as well. Where does the feedstock come from? What emissions are associated with that? That would include things like methane fugitive emissions upstream, for example. That's a common question that comes up. It will include things like, so if we're talking about green hydrogen and you're wanting to plug into the grid, it would include things like how clean that electricity supply is, for example. It will also include a bit of downstream stuff from the process. It's making an assumption that the hydrogen you produce has got to be pure, and it's got to be pressurized. It's got to be 30 bar of pressure. And so there's going to be emissions associated with driving compressors and driving equipment for purification. And if you're looking at blue hydrogen as well, it's also going to include emissions associated with the CCS bit of it. So it's potentially quite a tough target to meet. And we'll come back to that a little later on, particularly when we think about blue hydrogen. It shouldn't be a particularly tough target to meet if you're doing pure green hydrogen. You're plugging in a electrolyzer into a solar farm or a wind farm and exclusively using that electricity. But if you're talking about blue hydrogen and carbon capture, then there's going to be quite a bit of debate over the coming years as to how easy this target will be to meet. For green hydrogen, it does make the point that there's certain things that you've got to do in terms of auditing this. You've got to demonstrate, got to provide data that shows that you're operating at the time that your electricity input that you've claimed was actually generating. You've got to be able to show that you've got an agreement that covers the volume of electricity to cover the amount of electricity you've produced as well. So there's a big long document that kind of outlines in more detail exactly what's covered. But this is what's going to matter. What colour you call something is going to kind of nice. But in terms of policy, if to qualify for subsidies and supports and things that say we're supporting low carbon, it won't be what colour you call something. It'll be whether you are below this number or not. If you're below this number, whatever route you've used, you'll be fine. If you're above this number, you won't. So that's going to be common, not just in the UK, but that's going to be something I think you'll see different national standards, and then also international standards starting to emerge as well. So some routes. Now, that was part of policy. It's been quite a busy month here in the UK in terms of policy. There's a whole flurry of documents that have been chucked out. So lots of reading time if you have to wade through these things like I do. There was the energy security strategy, which is obviously in response to some of the other stuff that's going on at the moment, which was also all about, as the name suggests, focusing on things like domestic supply, not just domestic supply, but also making that affordable. And along with that, at the same time, were published two short summaries, basically trying to look at attracting investment into sectors. One was the hydrogen investor roadmap. The other was what's called the carbon capture utilization storage investor roadmap. I'll explain why that one matters shortly, but doesn't take a genius to know that that's because one of the options is blue hydrogen, and blue hydrogen is all about carbon capture and storage. That's what makes it different from grey hydrogen in effect. A few slides here are kind of full of text. Don't worry, I'm happy to give people the presentations so they don't have to worry about having to jot down every detail. I'll just kind of go through some of the main points. What was in the hydrogen investor roadmap? That kind of, and also out the energy security strategy. It was really an update on what was published last August, which was the UK's hydrogen strategy. Now, last August, the talk was about 5 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity by 2030. At that stage already, there was this talk of a twin track approach. So no, if you like, a hands-off approach to which route we should take. So through those all, I mean, my simplified routes and all the other possible routes you could have. No, the government saying, look, we're not kind of choosing one or the other. We can look at multiple routes, and that's where things like the hydrogen standard, the low carbon hydrogen standard, comes in. As long as you're low carbon, by our definition, you can use whatever route you want. Now, what happened with the energy security strategy recently was there was an update in terms of target, so doubling of the ambition. But with the usual kind of caveats. Now, anyone who's had a broadband contract will be nervous about terms like up to, for example. So up to 10 gigawatts. I mean, 2 gigawatts could be up to 10 gigawatts. And also this line, quite important, subject to affordability and value for money. So this isn't, it's not 10 gigawatts at any cost. There's already kind of caveats and, if you like, cynics might say get out clauses, escape ramps, if those targets aren't met, if they are regarded as too expensive. So there are there's kind of ambition, but that ambition has to fit in with this thing about affordability, and that's part of also the energy security side of it. In terms of where that should come from, it kind of reiterated this idea of a twin track approach. At least half from green hydrogen, the rest coming from other routes. 10 gigawatts by 2030, it's not realistic, obviously, to get anywhere near that anytime soon. So in the shorter term, by 2025, the targets are more modest, 2 gigawatts. There's various funds and various amounts of money to go with it. I've just mentioned about the low carbon hydrogen standard. And there's a few other lines. I think this line is quite an important one, particularly when we get onto blue hydrogen in a little while. Lines about, and again, this investor roadmap was about getting investors interested in the UK. One of the things that keeps coming out is this idea of what does the UK have? What kind of benefits or what unique, not necessarily unique, but what advantageous aspects does the UK have that could be useful from a hydrogen point of view? And you'll see lots of talk about infrastructure reuse. I'll come back to that, as I say, talking about particularly things like oil and gas infrastructure reuse. So there's various targets that are laid out. This twin track approach. Again, this is from the Hydrogen Investor Roadmap, a gigawatt of electrolytic hydrogen and a gigawatt of CCUS-enabled hydrogen, blue hydrogen. Now, again, targets. it remains to be seen exactly what the business models and the mechanisms will be to get those things built. So with green hydrogen, the government are talking about a couple of allocations for projects, for money for projects over the next couple of years, and then basically annual rounds, which we assume will be similar to kind of annual rounds that have been used for things like renewable power, auctions, those kind of things. Blue is a bit vaguer in some ways. So instead of specific dates, there's this idea of CCUS hydrogen, blue hydrogen by the mid-2020s. If you look at most of the blue hydrogen projects, kind of operational dates, they're looking at things like 2025, 2026, and so on. It remains to be seen exactly what they call the funding envelope. In other words, what is the process going to be? There's this talk about selecting the first projects, bilateral negotiations, etc. In other words, there's lots of talking in dark, smoky rooms, if those things still exist, about, okay, how much subsidy is it going to require to get some of these big blue hydrogen projects past their financial investment decision. And of course, key to all that is tying it in with what they call the CCUS cluster sequencing process. In other words, you can't produce blue hydrogen unless you've got somewhere to put the carbon that you capture. So it's all very well putting carbon capture on the hydrogen production plant, but it's got to go somewhere. Unless you've got other infrastructure, unless you've got carbon transport, storage, or utilization infrastructure that exists at the same time and is brought on stream at the same time, your blue hydrogen is kind of sitting there waiting for other things to happen. So there are some additional challenges around blue hydrogen, which is its tie-in with its kind of dependency on what happens in the CCUS part of things, which is why we get back to our CCUS investor document as well. There are lots of things happening. Again, if you kind of Google Hydrogen Investor Roadmap and download that document, this is kind of grabbed from that. You'll notice that the blue, handily the blue hydrogen stuff, CCUS enabled stuff, is in blue. So there's a few of those. There's probably more in the UK than in most other countries I've seen. The UK is probably more, maybe more bullish, maybe more blue hydrogen friendly, or trying to be more blue hydrogen friendly than lots of other countries. But in terms of numbers of projects, there's also lots and lots of electrolytic green hydrogen projects. Key difference between the two: the blue hydrogen projects tend to be big. The nature of those reforming and gasification plants is that you're going to be looking to build them big, economies of scale. Green hydrogen, you can build much smaller, and so it's a much more kind of modular technology. It's a bit more akin to things like solar PV and battery storage, in as much as if you want a huge project. Electrolyzers are very much kind of modular bits of equipment. You just kind of you can have to stack up lots of electrolyzers. But equally, if you only want small projects to produce enough hydrogen to fulfill a particular need, you can build a small electrolyzer. And there are potentially some advantages to that approach. It means that you can get a lot of things done. You can get a lot of projects done in a much shorter space of time. So there's lots of things, there's various things happening, there's various projects out there. A project on this map doesn't mean it will definitely happen. This is projects under development. It doesn't mean projects that have reached financial close and have got money sitting there waiting to be invested. It's projects, lots of particular blue ones, lots of projects which are still, as I say, discussing, lobbying with government about what level of support may be needed to actually follow them through into completion. So, production, economics. So these numbers, again, illustrative. You'll see loads of different numbers from loads of different people based on loads of different assumptions. So just to give a kind of a rough picture of kind of where we are. Now, I say where we are. I first drew this chart with the numbers in the black kind of last summer, at which point in time you would definitely say, well, green is a fair bit more expensive, certainly than grey, and even a fair bit more expensive than blue, although with the caveat that blue isn't really happening on any scale, because we simply haven't got grey hydrogen plants with CCS. There's kind of a handful globally, but certainly there's none in the UK. So these are kind of notional figures, if you like, based on projections of what it would cost to do blue hydrogen if you were to have either add on CCS to grey hydrogen or build from scratch. Of course, one thing that's changed over the last, since I drew this chart, is there's been a big spike in gas prices. I'll come back to that. I've got some charts on that shortly. And so when you run the numbers now for grey hydrogen, you've probably seen plenty of articles and so on suggesting that actually in today's climate, with today's gas prices, even grey hydrogen, emitting dirty grey hydrogen, can be as expensive, or even in some cases, depending on assumptions again, as expensive or more expensive than green hydrogen. And certainly when you start to add on CCS on top of that and come up with some notional numbers on how much that might cost, we may not actually be that different between the two. The other thing, when thinking about cost though, given that a lot of this is in the future, remember 90% of production is grey, we're talking about, certainly in the UK, nothing that's blue at the moment, and a fraction of a percentage that is green. What we should be thinking about more is future costs rather than current costs. And then we need to understand where costs come from. On the blue hydrogen side, the gas price is going to be a big chunk of it. So the majority of the levelized cost of hydrogen calculation, if you run that, is going to come from the input, the variable input, the price of gas. And then, of course, costs of CCS, which I would say are still fairly uncertain, and of course carbon price, because even with CCS, we're not talking about capturing 100% of the CO2, so there'll be some CO2 that will still be emitted, and there's going to be a carbon price to pay on top of that. The problem with these variables, of course, is they're very much variable. The gas price, as we've seen, can vary substantially over short periods of time. It'd be a brave person to say whether what the long-term price of natural gas is likely to be, where that's going to go. Carbon capture and storage costs, again, I would say are a lot of uncertainty around exactly what those will be. And of course, carbon price is set on a market, so that can bounce up and down as well. So we can look at some notional prices for blue hydrogen in the UK, and I'll show you a chart where the company has done that. But in terms of projecting those forward, that's going to be quite tricky, because the variables that feed into that cost are very much, there's no kind of clear pattern as to exactly where they might go going forwards. In fact, the carbon price, if you're going to say anything, you'd say the carbon price might go up. Maybe the CCS cost will come down, depending on how quickly that matures and so on. But natural gas price, well, who knows? Depends on all sorts of global factors, not just what's happening in the UK. On the green hydrogen side, of course, the advantage is that the two key costs there are the price of electricity and the cost of the kit. We know the cost of the kit is coming down already and is going to keep coming down due to bigger scale manufacturing, more automated manufacturing and so on. Following the same kind of cost reduction curves potentially we've seen with things like batteries and PV and that kind of stuff. You can argue about exactly what the percentages will be, but I think the kind of direction of travel is fairly well understood. Electricity price, now here, remember we're talking about renewables. I'm not talking about, shouldn't be talking about the price on the grid, because we need low carbon electricity. The price of renewable electricity has been coming down. Renewables have been getting cheaper. Solar panels have been getting cheaper. Offshore wind has been getting much cheaper. Onshore wind, if in the UK you were allowed to build any, would be getting cheaper as well. Obviously, those reductions start to tail off eventually, but there's no reason to think that those things are suddenly going to start going up. So in terms of future costs, that's why I've put a big question mark here. If we look at future costs of green, these aren't numbers for me or about the UK particularly, but these are the kind of projections that people like the Hydrogen Council make going forwards. There's lots of kind of wild numbers around how cheap green hydrogen could be. I don't necessarily buy all of them, but I certainly buy the idea that the direction of travel is downwards. So, I say the reasons for that: electrolyzers, cheaper electrolyzers. We know the market for those is going to boom. It's going to go up quite substantially. We know that, for example, Chinese systems are extremely cheap compared to Western systems. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to buy at those prices if you want that kit installed in the UK, for example. But they're still talking about being much cheaper once these Chinese brands start expanding outside China and start exporting further around the world. The price, that's going to have a big impact on prices of kit in markets like the UK. So electrolyzer costs are going to come down. I don't think there's any. I think you'd be, let's say, brave inverted commas to suggest that that's not going to happen and is not going to be quite a substantial cost reduction. And it's also price of electricity. Now, depending on what you attach your green hydrogen or electrolyzer to, actually the cost of the kit, the capex, makes the biggest difference. Reducing the cost of that makes the biggest difference actually if you're operating your kit at what you call lower load factor. So if you're attached directly into something like a solar power plant, certainly here in the UK, you're not going to be getting a huge load factor, depending how you size your electrolyzer against the solar power plant. But with offshore wind now, we're talking about load factors more up to kind of 55–60% for some of the upcoming offshore wind projects. Once you run your equipment more of the time, it's the electricity that starts to make the biggest share of that cost. And so we can make lots and lots of cheaper kit, but also that cost of electricity keeping coming down is also going to be an important factor. There might be other things. We're seeing an increasing number of projects in green hydrogen, which are looking at other aspects. So oxygen is a useful thing to have. There might be some value in selling oxygen. There could be value, particularly in bigger projects, of putting heat into district heating systems, for example. And also this, the idea that electrolyzers kind of by their nature become part of the electricity supply system. And so the idea of operating them flexibly potentially has some merit and has some value add as well. So there's various things we can look at in terms of all those kind of factors which can help bring down the cost of green hydrogen: cheaper kit, cheaper electricity, renewable electricity, selling other things that we're producing anyway from that kit, and potentially operating that kit in a flexible manner. In other words, hydrogen becoming part of the kind of electrification story and part of the kind of flexible electricity system. And there's going to be value in flexibility the more renewables we put into the electricity system. So from a cost point of view, an economic point of view, there are lots of reasons to think that green hydrogen is going to be cheaper. I think there are some other things that potentially don't get as much emphasis as they should when we look at green hydrogen as an option for hydrogen supply, and that's the fact it can be small. Lots of headlines tend to focus on things that are massive. Let's do big scale this, gigawatt scale that. What we saw with solar, for example, we didn't immediately go out and start building enormous utility scale solar farms. We started building small scale solar because you could do it quickly, cheaply, less money at risk, more locations that you could put it. We've seen the same with battery storage projects within the grid. They're getting bigger and bigger, but they started off smaller. With green, one advantage of a technology which is by its nature small modules which then stack up into big things is that you can do small things. You can containerize them, you can create them off-site, bring them in a truck, plug them in, get them running in very little time. You don't need a huge amount of space. So you can do, there's advantages in being able to do things not just big, but do things small, particularly in the early stages of an industry growing. It makes it a bit less complicated. It means from a financing point of view, there's less money at risk and so on. So there's all sorts of reasons why that might help. And so what we see with green, there's a whole bunch of projects from sub-megawatts to kind of a few megawatts to tens of megawatts and potentially going forwards into hundreds of megawatts. So, but what you see with blue hydrogen is all hundreds of megawatts projects. It's all kind of straight to big stuff. No one's talking about doing blue hydrogen on a kind of 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt scale. The advantages to small scale can also include you can scale it to provide supply to a particular source of demand. So if I'm a filling station or if I'm a small industrial user, and I need a certain amount of hydrogen, you can size an electrolyzer to provide that amount of hydrogen. Whereas blue hydrogen, the business case for blue hydrogen, by its nature, you're basically building something that's going to produce a lot of hydrogen, and you're going to need multiple customers for that hydrogen. So from setting up kind of offtake agreements and so on, you've got to achieve a scale of demand before you can make the case for building that source of supply. And also you've got to get the hydrogen from where you produce it to those multiple customers. So in the short run, you probably need those customers also to be very close to your hydrogen plant because there's no infrastructure to move it about. So I think I wouldn't dismiss here in the UK for sure, but elsewhere in the world, some of the advantages of being small. No, we tend to focus on being big, but I think being small from a practical point of view is actually quite advantageous in the short run in terms of getting some of these industries going. Blue, and so what we see with blue, very different. It's a very different option in terms of supply, I would say. We need, and it doesn't have to be natural gas, but in the UK, we're largely going to be talking about availability of natural gas. But not just that, we also need, as I say, somewhere to be able to put CO2. We need the infrastructure, the transport, the geology, the other things that you need to be able to complete your, not just carbon capture, but the storage, the transport and storage bit of that supply chain. And so what we see to try and meld those two things together is you see plans for big production plants, hundreds of megawatts, located at places where there's likely to be those multiple hydrogen off-takers close by, and also there's likely to be multiple sources of CO2 so that someone can make the case for investing in the CO2 infrastructure without just building it for one hydrogen plant. So if someone's going to build CO2 pipes and CO2 injection facilities out in the North Sea, for example, to stuff CO2 under the sea floor, they're not going to do that, have their entire business case dependent on one clean hydrogen plant, one blue hydrogen plant. That might be a useful anchor project, but that infrastructure is going to be built to serve things like industrial decarbonisation, industrial carbon capture. So there's an inherent link between kind of industrial centres, industrial hubs, and carbon capture and storage and blue hydrogen production. It's a very different, if you like, it's going to be much more kind of centralised, whereas green hydrogen can be a much more kind of distributed method of hydrogen production. That's true of the UK. I think you'll find that will also be true in many other markets as well. Ideally, of course, you want not to have to build all that infrastructure from scratch, but we're also back to reuse, particularly of existing gas infrastructure. If part of the idea is that hydrogen demand is going to be, it's going to exist because you're replacing natural gas usage, kind of substitutional, then hopefully some of that natural gas infrastructure will start to become available to repurpose for moving other things about, either hydrogen or moving CO2 about potentially. Again, it doesn't mean you can do that. It's not necessarily a trivial thing to do, but it's going to be cheaper and easier than building new pipelines and things from scratch. Of course, the downsides, as I mentioned earlier, are things like the gas price. So here was it's UK natural gas price, bumbling along at a fairly bit of up and down. You can see a bit of seasonal sway here, less in the summer, more in the winter, and then suddenly it all kind of went a bit bananas in the middle of last year. And we've had various spikes, huge spikes. It's kind of dropped down a little bit since. This chart I accessed just on Friday, I think that's Friday or Thursday last week. And of course, if that's natural gas is the biggest cost in terms of the cost of hydrogen that you produce, not surprisingly, if we home in on that, we can look at this kind of chart. So these are some numbers from Standard & Poor's Global, calculated numbers in terms of blue hydrogen costs. Now it says blue hydrogen costs. Obviously, I can't go and buy any blue hydrogen in the UK at the moment. So these are calculated costs. These are their numbers running their model with whatever particular assumptions have gone into that model as to how much they think blue hydrogen would cost in the UK over the past. I've looked at over the past year. So on this chart, it's literally it's looking from kind of here through to here, April to April. And so not surprisingly, you've got kind of 3 spikes here in terms of gas price. You've got 3 spikes here in terms of produced hydrogen cost. So how much is blue hydrogen going to cost in future? Well, who knows? Going back to here, is this just a blip and it'll drop down and then bumble along down here? Are we going to level out at some gas price which is more kind of up here? Yeah, well, your guess is as good as mine. If I took that back more than 5 years, but took it back 15 years, 20 years, the lifetime of one of these plants you're investing in, there's just inherently a bigger gas price. There's a big gas price risk in terms of blue hydrogen costs, which you don't have so much in green hydrogen. Particularly if you're building if you're attaching dedicated renewable power, because renewable power, at least if we're talking about things like solar and wind, there's no fuel cost that's going to make that bounce up and down. Once you've built your plants, you're quite happy to sign a 20-year power purchase agreement with somebody at a certain price, because you're just about paying back your capital. So I think that price stability is going to be an important part of considerations, particularly if we think about this in the context of that energy security and so on. So blue hydrogen so gas price is one, and the other thing is that blue hydrogen, of course, is intimately linked to CCUS, in as much as you can't have blue hydrogen if you've not got carbon capture and storage, or CCUS if you want to include utilization of that. So here in the UK, it also pays to be aware of what's happening on that front. The UK is probably one of the more kind of bullish, forward-looking, whatever you want to call it, foolish if you don't like CCUS, in terms of CCUS. So the target is to have 2 CCUS clusters, industrial clusters with carbon capture and storage infrastructure by the middle of the decade, and then 4 in total by 2030. There's money available to help support the costs of building some of this infrastructure. We don't know exactly how that linkage with carbon capture and storage and hydrogen production is going to play out in terms of money. It talks about here, this cluster sequencing process, which I mentioned earlier on, will be announced later this year. So there's lots of conversations going on. But I think a key context to this for the UK is this kind of stuff, what's called the North Sea Transition Deal. And that's probably the key line. A big driver of this is not just kind of things like dollar per kilogram costs on an Excel spreadsheet, a big driver towards the use of blue hydrogen in the UK is because it gives something for the North Sea to do going forwards. That's a slightly simplistic way of describing it, but this idea of reusing, having all that expertise, having all those people employed in jobs that involve geology and understanding subsea geology and have been paid to kind of bring things out of the North Sea for decades. There's a lot of focus on now paying them to put things back into the North Sea and not just losing those skills, not just having those people out of work, not just waste, not just decommissioning and letting that kind of infrastructure, those pipelines, those platforms and so on go to waste. So I think you've got to, it's being aware of the kind of political and economic context within which some of these decisions are going to be made as well. It's not, I think it's important to step back sometimes from just some of the raw numbers and the kind of Excel spreadsheet analysis of blue versus green, for example, and also think of some of the kind of political, economic, social, job creation, value chain context within which these things lie. And certainly in the UK, that was a really telling line out of the CCUS investor document, was about this idea of a second lease of life for the North Sea, extending the value of the UK continental shelf, the UK, and it's not just the North Sea, but also off the West Coast as well. So there are, in terms of industrial clusters, the two that have already been, well, it's kind of shows three on this map, but on the West Coast and then these two together on the East Coast, they are the two that have been selected thus far for that, trying to get those in place by the middle of this decade. And then for the further two, for the end of the decade, there's obviously going to be lots of lobbying and arguing and feasibility studies and so on to try and determine where the other two will come from. Time whizzes by. In the context of, we started at the beginning this low carbon hydrogen standard. Now green, particularly as long as you're attached, as long as you're using full renewable power for your electrolyzer, meeting that hydrogen standard is unlikely to be a problem. But what about blue? This was an article in Recharge News the other day, which with various quotes from various people. I think it's a bit early for lots of people to have done the maths in great detail. It'll be interesting to see some of the opinions that come out over the next few months on this. Equinor, of course, who are very much in favour of blue hydrogen because they sell a lot of natural gas. They also have lots of expertise in carbon capture and storage from what they do in Norway, for example. Not surprisingly, regard it as feasible to fit into that standard, but it's quite a strict standard compared to some of the numbers that people were thinking about before. So again, this was Equinor talking about you probably have to have kind of 95% carbon capture rates to be able to do that. And certainly remember that within the definition, it included the feedstock emissions. So they're talking about needing to be less than this 1% emissions in terms of the upstream natural gas supply. Now, the UK government reckons that currently natural gas from the UK network is about 0.8 to 1%. So you're going to have to, it's going to be a combination of making sure the natural gas supply is very clean and also that the carbon capture rates are very high. It's going to be problematic, let's say not possible, to do it with LNG imports, for example, and that's a challenge going forwards if, given that the UK is a kind of net importer. And of course, key line at the bottom, just because something's possible doesn't mean it's profitable. And that's where I think things like the cost of those very high carbon capture rates and also the infrastructure to do something with the carbon will come into play as well. So I think with blue hydrogen, there's quite a lot of I think there's more, I would say there's more uncertainty, there's some bigger challenges around making blue hydrogen certainly fit into that low carbon standard, and in the short run, kind of getting it going. Here's my quick summary of kind of pros and cons of those various routes. With blue, I think this is a big one, the dependency on CCS infrastructure. You can't really move blue hydrogen forward unless you move carbon capture and storage forward. So you've got kind of two business cases, and we're talking about big infrastructural business cases and big investments that have to be able to kind of move in step with each other. So there's a kind of there's a dependency of certainly hydrogen on CCS, and to some extent CCS on hydrogen, given that that would be a big source of captured carbon in the short run. Also, from a cleanliness point of view, it's going to be higher emissions numbers anyway. There's more risk around price and so on as well. On the other hand, again, if we're transitioning away from natural gas, we can, in terms of end use, we have that natural gas supply available. The downside for green hydrogen, of course, is we've got to build lots of new renewables. We can't just kind of take renewables that are putting electricity into the electricity network and say, this is clean hydrogen, because that would just be that we just have kind of had less renewables for electricity. So it's going to be additionality. This term additionality will have to happen. We'll have to build more renewables, and that's not quick. That potentially takes time. There's all the kind of planning, permitting. There's also things like land use, which I probably could have put on here as well. It's going to take up more space. On the other hand, actually I put less land use for blue. I could put more land use for green. On the other hand, it's going to be cleaner. I think this is important. The fact that certainly in the short run, getting the hydrogen market going, it's going to be smaller, quicker, easier to deploy. Not least because you can scale it to meet a particular source of demand. And in the short run, demands are not going to be enormous. Demand is going to grow. Again, depending on your opinion, could grow quite slowly, could certainly go quite gradually, could grow in particular locations, not kind of uniformly. So the ability to deploy supply to meet specific demands is quite useful. And also I think green, another one I think that's potentially underestimated is this idea, the fact that green kind of inherently has some links with this idea of kind of electrification of the system, in particular around how to provide flexibility into a more electrified energy system. And I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I think pretty much slides-wise, we're probably done. I've just summarised kind of some of the political economic drivers that will determine choices of green versus blue, again focusing on the UK, but I think this list certainly makes sense wherever you are. It's not going to be, people often are in one camp or the other. I think they're very different things. They're very different kind of by their nature. One, as I say, very much centralised. One could be big, centralised, but also lends itself to more distributed application. In the case of green, it's a bit like, I guess that's a bit like the change from conventional power generation to renewable power generation. We can do big scale renewables, but we can also do small scale renewables, but you don't have kind of local coal power plants, and you do have actually small gas power plants, but nuclear and so on. There's some things that have to be big, but there's some things that, multiple scales. Obviously, resources, both renewable but also fossil resources, are going to matter. If you're an exporter of fossil fuels, if you've got more fossil fuels than you know what to do with, then you're going to have a different view of the world potentially. Geology, can you do CCS? Geography, have you got enough space? But then this kind of stuff, jobs, infrastructure, exports, all that kind of thing are going to play into choices that are made as well. Okay, so that was a bit rapid. Well, it seemed rapid to me, probably might have seemed slow to you, but anyway, the time goes pretty quickly. I wanted to leave a bit of time for questions. Now, there's a bit of a mix of, some people have used the Q&A window, I think most of you have used the Q&A window. There's a few bits in chat as well. Let's look at Q&A first. So I'm just going to do them in the order of which I think they popped into the window. Finn, when you produce methanol with green hydrogen and fossil carbon dioxide, is the product perceived as renewable or green? Yes, is the short answer. Oh, sorry, no is the short answer. So green hydrogen and, well, fossil CO2, captured fossil CO2, yes. So when people talk about green methanol production, what they're talking about is kind of what I think what you're saying. So you produce hydrogen in a clean manner, and actually wouldn't necessarily have to be green hydrogen, but low carbon hydrogen. Again, back to our hydrogen standard, it could be blue hydrogen with 95% carbon capture and storage. So some kind of hydrogen that's been produced in a clean manner, and carbon dioxide that's been captured from another process, and combining them together to produce methanol. Now, again, I would suggest with methanol, it's always one of those things where it's a bit like our carbon standard. You can't really, it's not a simple black and white green or not green. The captured fossil carbon, for example, what was the capture rate of that fossil carbon? What's the source? Again, you'd have to look at kind of really what you should be doing is a kind of life cycle assessment for those fuels. And I think what you'll start to see is, I don't see why in the future you wouldn't also start to see standards around things like green methanol, green ammonia. In fact, green ammonia, there was the first certification of green ammonia was provided by what do you call it? One of the German certification agencies to a project in Oman looking at green ammonia. It's not been built yet, but they were going through the licensing, the certification process, so that they could be, they'd have their kind of assessment, and they could start to put a green ammonia tag onto their product, which makes it then easier to sell. So yeah, if it's green hydrogen and captured carbon, then yes, it would be renewable. Of course, if it's captured carbon from a bioenergy project, you could argue that's even greener. So as I say, I think in future, it's the green, renewable, those kind of tags are going to be less important than the certification, the numbers, the life cycle assessments, how none of these things are zero carbon, but how low carbon are they? And so it's going to be providing purchasers with a measure of kind of what carbon content is associated with the product that they're buying, and the lower, the better. Alan, what is meant by input materials? So I'm guessing you probably mean the slide where it's talking about that kind of low carbon standard thing. So input materials, again, those, if you Google the document, it's free to download. It will kind of explain a bit more detail, but from memory, it's including things like in the green hydrogen process. It would include things like catalysts and basically materials and that have a carbon footprint associated with them that are used in the process. I can't remember if that particular category also included things like the feedstock and stuff that goes with it. But it's basically that it lays out exactly what it's trying to capture as much as possible of everything that gets used in that production of hydrogen, whatever method it is, be it green or blue. And the equipment and as I say, the consumables and so on. So with carbon capture and storage, it would include materials would include things like the amines, if you're using amine for carbon capture and storage, what the kind of carbon footprint associated with those would be. UK, Alan again, UK ESS, no mention of import structure, i.e. ammonia. I didn't see anything specifically in the energy security strategy around ammonia. No, I think is the short answer of that. Doesn't mean ammonia is not. I think import, I think as a general theme here in the UK, the idea is to try and avoid just replacing one set of imports for another set of imports. So I think the focus here is going to be much more on domestic production, and in fact with an aim potentially to even be an exporter in the future. So But I think that as far as I'm aware, ammonia didn't specifically come up, but there are projects here in the UK looking at ammonia from hydrogen. Do existing grey hydrogen producers pay a carbon price? That's a good question. In other words, are they part of the UK carbon trading scheme, carbon market? That's a good question. I think they do, but I wouldn't swear by it. I'm fairly certain they're part of, their emissions are part of the they're covered in the trading scheme. So I think the answer is yes, but now you've asked the question, I'm kind of slightly doubting myself. So anyway. Alan, are you factoring increased risk premium in the last 2 months for grey blue hydrogen? So it depends what you mean. I'm factoring it. So I guess that's what I was talking about when I mentioned variability of price security, and so on. So I think one thing that's changed over the last few months is absolutely the idea that, and if I'm an investor, there's absolutely a premium that's going to be seen as a higher risk around particularly gas prices and gas supply, which factors into grey or blue that doesn't factor into green. I think that's kind of a point I was trying to make. Now, in terms of those Standard and Poor's calculations where they kind of came up with numbers, I don't think, and again, I can't speak for them, I didn't do the calculations, it's they have their own methodology. I know they factor in carbon price into that, and they factor in some assumptions around carbon capture costs, but they don't, for example, factor in transport and storage costs for carbon, and I don't think they're factoring a kind of more intangible risk premium, if you like, on that, which would come into play in terms of things like financing cost, really. What is your view of distribution, David, sorry, what is your view of distribution of hydrogen as a liquid, which is common in the USA? Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. So it depends on kind of numbers I've seen and discussions I've had have tended to be, it's a question of scale. As you start to scale up, then transportation by liquid hydrogen starts to make more sense over and above hydrogen as compressed gas on tube trailers. And simply because, I mean, what the state of the art now is something like you can get 4 tons of hydrogen on a truck in liquid form, as opposed to kind of one ton on a truck in gas form. So if you want to move however many tons, you need 4 times as many trucks if you're doing it as gas. So I think distribution of hydrogen, as it scales up, certainly if you're distributing within country, and then shipping is kind of a different question, then yes, I as far as I'm aware, the numbers move towards kind of liquid. But of course, better than all those, if you can do it, of course, is pipeline. So, and this is where it will also tie into kind of, well, where is hydrogen going to be used and where's it going to be supplied? So that's the beauty of things like focusing first on those industrial uses and industrial clusters, for example, where you can potentially create relatively large sources of demand in one location. You can provide supply, you can justify building short but volumetrically useful pipelines, or you can start to reuse existing pipelines, and so cut out some of that road transport side of things altogether. But certainly in terms of larger scale, having to move it around by road, I think, again, I couldn't tell you exactly what break-even points in terms of volumes per year or whatever. I've seen different numbers on that anyway from different people. But there's certainly you get to a point where as the volume gets bigger, moving things around as a liquid make more sense than moving it around as compressed gas. Could I look at the gas price variation over the last 15 years? well, I'm not going to do that now. I give you the website looking at UK gas prices. If you go to that website, click that link, then you can select different time frames for that. But it's certainly bounced up and down. You found that, for example, if you go back before the financial crash, gas prices are very high, and then they kind of dipped down, and then they recovered a bit, and then you had COVID and they went down. So you get various ups and downs over time. Gianluca, is it generally cheaper to retrofit carbon capture or replace natural gas with hydrogen, e.g. on glass production? Yeah, good question. Don't know. Don't know the answer. It's not just glass production, but also cement. There's various, even power generation as well. There's lots of discussion around different options, and they're the two options that you kind of mentioned. Really, is one, do you just carry on using natural gas and capture the carbon post combustion? Hydrogen, really, the way to think about that in that context is it's pre-combustion carbon capture and storage. So you take the natural gas, you strip the carbon out of it before you use the fuel, and so then you're just burning hydrogen, and you don't have to do that post-combustion carbon capture. As a rule, and a kind of variable rule, capturing carbon post-combustion is going to be generally more expensive than capturing carbon pre-combustion, because combusting natural gas, at least if you're combusting it in air, which we're generally going to be doing, most of what comes through your post-combustion process is a bunch of nitrogen, because the air is mostly nitrogen. So you get mostly nitrogen, you get some steam, you get some other bits and pieces, and you get a relatively small percentage of CO2. And so capturing CO2 out of a load of other stuff is going to be harder, more expensive, whereas capturing from something like a hydrogen production process, the concentrations of hydrogen you're talking about are going to be higher in the gas stream. There's less of this, depending exactly how there's ways you can run that process to maximize the percentage of CO2 in the gas stream you're trying to capture, which makes the process much easier. So what's less, so it's a general rule. Now, that what's less kind of where that I would say that might be different is you're talking specifically about retrofit. So from a greenfield perspective, you would tend to favour kind of pre-combustion carbon capture. Retrofit, there's lots of other factors that are going to come into play there in terms of the particular plant, the particular location. Have you got room to fit the kit? Again, exactly what are the details of the process? So I think there it becomes not necessarily so clear cut, but anyway, slightly avoiding the answer there, I suppose. Hydrogen fugitive emissions. The same day as all those papers came out, again, I could have gone on for hours, but in the interest of time, there was a paper from the UK government about hydrogen fugitive emissions and also the greenhouse gas impacts of hydrogen. So it's certainly something that is on the agenda. And I think the short answer is yes, there would be a kind of CO2 equivalent number that they will use. And I think they've said how they're going to calculate those emissions, because actually there's some controversy over things like timeframes that they've used and so on. So yes, you'll have to pay for them. So I'm going to rattle through quite quickly. I don't have to go, but I know some people do have to go. Potential business case for green hydrogen from curtailed renewables. The problem with that is, and I showed a chart showing kind of utilization rate against hydrogen costs. If you don't use your electrolyzer very often, the cost of hydrogen goes through the roof. It kind of heads exponentially upwards as you go to low utilization rates. And so unless you've got a lot of curtailed renewables, the cost of the hydrogen you produce is going to be very, very expensive. So in the short run, I would say the opportunity for that is pretty small. But of course, as we go forwards, and this is where I think green hydrogen, that's my point about green hydrogen fitting in with a kind of electrification picture, is that as we go forwards and potentially overbuild things like solar and wind. One feature of that system could be much higher curtailment rates. We might build stuff because it's kind of cheap to produce electricity, but accept the fact that there'll be a big lump of curtailment from that. And again, depending how you size the electrolyzer relative to the renewables that you're building, you could then start to use big chunks of curtailed electricity, produce quite high load factors, and then your costs of hydrogen come down. So that's a kind of potential business case in future, might be reasonable, but I would say for the foreseeable future, just using curtailed electricity is not really there. Roberto, do you know how much CO2 you produce per ton of kilogram for hydrogen in blue hydrogen production? So, well, again, a lot of the blue hydrogen production at the moment is a bit notional. In terms of current, the handful of plants around the world that do have carbon capture attached to a hydrogen plant, the CO2 capture rates are pretty low because their primary purpose is not to maximize carbon capture, it's to produce a certain amount of carbon capture and normally to sell that to things like oil companies to do enhanced oil recovery. So how much you produce is going to depend on carbon capture rates. If you're talking about 95% capture and 90% capture, you're going to be down towards, the idea is you're down towards similar numbers for that hydrogen standard. So you're probably looking at kind of 2 or 3 kilograms of hydrogen, CO2 per ton of hydrogen from a process point of view. Status of hydrogen storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, not proven. There is a couple of projects where they've used blended, I think up to 10% hydrogen with natural gas in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, but 100% hydrogen has never been done, I think I'm right in saying. Do you think, Nick, do you think the drive to wean ourselves off Russian oil and gas will speed up the development of hydrogen, especially green? Yes. So I'm going to be quick now. I don't know whether we get cut off. How do you see liquefied green hydrogen replacing and competing with LNG? Too early to say. I would suggest. I don't think it necessarily, anytime soon, it doesn't compete or replace, I would say. That's a further forward thing. I think the trading of green hydrogen on a kind of, we're talking about international trading there, you're looking more towards kind of end of decade and into the 2030s. So I don't see it competing with LNG directly, particularly soon. Patrice, is there any intent to the UK to have 2 different quality of hydrogen at the hydrogen refueling station? One for fuel cells and one for... I've not come across that, no. No, I've not come across 2 different quality standards. Michael, cost of CCS yet to be determined. Do you think we will ever see a time when nuclear electricity will be used for hydrogen production? Yes, I do. I know that here in the UK, EDF, for example, are very keen on that. I know in various other countries, nuclear power plants are very keen on it. It potentially for them, I mean, it's a bit back to the question of curtailment. One of the criticisms of nuclear power plants, of course, is inflexibility. What hydrogen potentially provides is the ability for nuclear power plants even to just kind of churn away producing electricity, and rather than be flexible in what they input to the grid. So instead of turning up and down to try and match demand or requirement in the grid, they just churn away, produce electricity, but put into the grid what's required from the grid. If there's lots of wind blowing, then they just don't put it into the grid and they use it to produce hydrogen instead. The other advantage nuclear power plants have is that they produce an awful lot of heat, and so you can potentially use what's called high temperature electrolysis, which you can also produce hydrogen a bit more efficiently. Sorry, I'm rattling through a bit. It's probably going to be endless. Tanya, although green hydrogen projects are scalable and smaller projects are feasible, isn't large scale needed to bring the electricity cost down quickly? That's happened with offshore wind costs. Well, again, I think offshore wind is a good example. I think solar is a good example. the thing with offshore wind, it's now that we're starting to see gigawatt offshore wind farms. Offshore wind, there's a kind of minimum scale that makes it worthwhile, but the initial offshore wind farms were certainly a lot smaller than they are today. And if I look at solar, what drove the cost of solar down was really rooftop solar in Germany first, and then it was a few megawatts of land-based systems around Europe. We only built the gigawatt scales. The gigawatt scale only appeared when the costs had started to come down. Now, when you build a gigawatt scale stuff, that drives the cost down even further. It's kind of a virtuous circle. But I think the initial, no one's going to go out and commit to massive gigawatt scale green hydrogen project, I would suggest, unless they're working on a basis of a certain cost, which is not today's cost, it's a reduced cost. So I think the short-term stuff, I think lots of small scale stuff can add up to a big enough volume that it can start to bring those costs down. That's what we saw in batteries, what we saw in PV. I would say the economics are slightly different in offshore wind, but we still saw it with offshore wind a little bit. So the quicker you can get to larger scale, the better. But to get to any kind of large scale, I think you can't get there without also having some of these less glamorous projects out. David, impact of material supply limitations. Yeah, iridium is certainly one that comes up. Platinum, potentially less total constraint on platinum, but iridium certainly. It might change, depends, it might change the type of green hydrogen electrolyzer. Not all green hydrogen uses iridium or platinum. If you're using alkaline electrolyzers, for example, you don't need those things. They're really a break on PEM. Polymer exchange membrane. Will it in the short run? I suspect not, but certainly you can find reports around how much extra iridium supply you will need if you're going to grow huge amounts of PEM electrolyzers. It might have an impact on choices people make between technologies. How much electricity is required on average for a kilogram of hydrogen? It depends on the electrolyzer. It can be anywhere from, if you've got high temperature electrolyzers with lots of nice available waste heat, it can be down at kind of 40, low 40s. If you're talking about traditional alkaline PEM electrolyzers, you're somewhere between kind of 50, 58 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen, but it depends on the electrolyzer you bought. And water, you're normally talking about 10 litres of water per kilogram. That's 10 litres of purified water. You might need double that to go into your kind of purifier to produce your kilogram of hydrogen. David, do you think that burning hydrogen in air will be limited in the long term to avoid producing NOx? Yes. I think the issue there is, the other way you could turn that is, do I think NOx standards will be relaxed to allow more hydrogen burning? And the answer is no. So if hydrogen is going to be combusted, for example, in modified natural gas turbines and so on, they will have to meet those NOx standards. And so they will have to, and there's quite a lot of work going on in looking at how you modify the combustion mechanisms, pre-combustion, and also potentially NOx capture post-combustion to try and stay within those standards. So that might limit what you can feasibly do. But I think that's a better way to phrase the question is, I think hydrogen will have to fit in with whatever the NOx standards are. I don't think regulators are suddenly going to relax those standards to allow more hydrogen to be burnt. So that will be a limit. There's technological solutions to that. I'm just seeing if there's anything different. There's a few things in the chat window as well, but we could be here all day. Yeah, we could well be here all day if we look at all that. Just think, is there anything that particularly pops out? there's a few. Yeah, so a couple of people made points about turquoise pyrolysis and said I've not considered it as a third avenue. I certainly wouldn't say that. I think it's an important mechanism. It's the reason I've focused here on green and blue is that in terms of big scale, they're the two core avenues. I think pyrolysis, there are some limits in terms of turquoise and pyrolysis in terms of, for example, if you're using natural gas as your feedstock, if you want to get an amount of hydrogen out of an amount of natural gas, reforming is just a better way to do that. You get more hydrogen per unit of natural gas that you put into that process than you do with pyrolysis, and partly that's actually because with reforming you stick in a load of water as well and get hydrogen out of the water. And also with turquoise, because the business case is very much around the value of the carbon, there's potentially some limits around kind of saturation of the carbon value as well. Again, so we could spend hours exploring that. Yeah, there's various things in the chat window which are comments, which is fine. I don't think there's anything else that I've kind of particularly stands out. Do we have to change the pipeline from natural gas to hydrogen as part of infrastructure? Possibly. Well, you'll certainly have to change, you might not have to change the pipeline itself. In the UK, for example, there's lots of plastic pipeline in the natural gas infrastructure, but there are things in that infrastructure like compressors, which you'll certainly have to change. I think, yeah, we talked a bit about hydrogen leakage. A few comments on that. Okay, I think we shall, yeah, I think I'll call it a day for the moment. Hopefully we've answered most of the main questions. We'd be here all day otherwise. As I say, I don't know quite how the mechanism of this works, but the slides, I'll make sure the organisers have them. And there's no problem making those available to you. By all means, if you've got other questions, comments and so on, you can find me on LinkedIn or whatever. You can drop me an email. I'll do my best to respond. I don't obviously sit there running a kind of 24-hour helpline, but if you've got quick questions or there's other bits of quick information that you might find useful, then I'm more than happy to be contacted as well. Okay, I make it 12:30. Let's call it a day for the moment, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it and good luck with whatever you're doing next.